The leather of the booth was old and deep red, worn smooth by decades of secrets. Julian Thorne sat alone. His presence filled the corner of the restaurant, a pocket of silence in the low hum of clinking glasses and quiet conversation. He owned the restaurant. He owned the building. He owned the silence. A glass of amber liquid sat untouched before him. His hands, large and marked by a life of hard decisions, rested on the table. Very still. His men stood at a respectful distance. Two by the main entrance, another near the kitchen doors. They were part of the architecture, unnoticed by the patrons but felt by everyone. Their stillness was a reflection of his own. A promise of violence held in perfect reserve. This was his ritual. Every Thursday night, he came to this place, the first legitimate business he had ever purchased. It was a monument to a different kind of power. The power of appearances. The power of quiet control. He watched the diners. Couples celebrating anniversaries. Businessmen closing deals. They existed in a world he curated for them, a safe, elegant space where the harsh realities of the city could not touch them. They were safe because he was here. They were also unsafe if they ever crossed a line they did not know existed. His gaze was distant, his thoughts miles and years away. The amber in the glass caught the light, and for a moment, he saw a memory in it. A flicker of a younger man's hope. A ghost he had long since buried under a mountain of wealth and fear. Then, the order of his world fractured. A disturbance at the door. It was not a threat. Not a rival. It was something far more unusual. A young woman. She was arguing in hushed, desperate tones with the maitre d', a man who knew better than to let anyone uninvited near Julian Thorne. She was holding a small, woven basket. She looked thin. Tired. The city had been chewing on her for a while. Her coat was clean but worn at the cuffs. Her eyes were wide with a frantic energy that spoke of looming deadlines and final notices. Julian watched, his expression unchanged. Usually, he would have let it play out. The maitre d' would handle it. She would be escorted out, gently but firmly. The disturbance would be smoothed over. But she slipped past him. A quick, desperate move. She was inside the main dining room before anyone could properly react. His men tensed, their hands shifting inside their jackets. Leo, his most trusted, took half a step forward, his eyes locked on the woman. Julian raised a single finger from the table. A minute, almost imperceptible gesture. Leo stopped. The other men relaxed their posture, but their eyes remained sharp. The order was given. Wait. The woman moved between the tables, her basket held out. It was filled with small, delicate flowers crafted from paper. She was trying to sell them. Here. In his restaurant. The audacity was breathtaking. Or perhaps it was not audacity. Perhaps it was just pure, undiluted desperation. She was met with shakes of the head. Cold shoulders. Annoyed glances. Each rejection seemed to chip away at her, her shoulders slumping a little more. She was making her way toward his corner. Julian did not move. He simply watched her approach, a strange curiosity stirring in him. He had not felt curiosity in a very long time. She finally stood before his table. She did not seem to know who he was. To her, he was just another patron, an older man sitting alone. Her ignorance was a shield, protecting her from the fear that would have paralyzed anyone else. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice soft and trembling slightly. "Would you like to buy a flower? For a lady? Or just to brighten the room?" "They're handmade." She held out the basket. The paper flowers were intricate, beautiful. Each one a small work of art. But Julian was not looking at the flowers. He was looking at her hand. On the third finger of her right hand was a ring. It was a simple silver band, but it was not plain. Etched into its surface was a pattern of intertwined vines, and nestled among them, almost hidden, was a single, tiny star. The world stopped. The low hum of the restaurant faded into a distant roar. The air in his lungs turned to ice. His heart, a dormant, heavy thing in his chest, gave a painful lurch. He knew that ring. He had held it in his own hands, nearly 40 years ago. He had commissioned it himself from an old-world jeweler, a man long dead. He had traced the pattern of the vines with his thumb before placing it on the finger of a girl with eyes the color of a summer sky. Isabella. Without thinking, without conscious thought, his hand shot out. It was not a violent move, but it was swift and absolute. He took her hand in his. His grip was not painful, but it was unbreakable. She gasped, startled, trying to pull back. Her eyes widened with fear, the desperation replaced by alarm. Finally, she saw him. She saw the man everyone else saw. The danger. His men moved again, a rustle of expensive wool and oiled steel. Again, he stopped them with a look. He stared at the ring, his thumb stroking the familiar, impossible pattern of the vines. His voice, when it came, was a rasp. A sound dragged up from a place of deep, buried grief. "Your ring," he said, his eyes lifting from the silver band to meet her terrified gaze. "Where did you get it?" He would not let go. "Stay with me until the end, because what happens next is a story about a promise that spanned 40 years, and a debt that could only be paid in blood. This is a story you won't want to miss. If you appreciate stories about honor, redemption, and the kind of love that never truly dies, make sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button so you never miss a new tale. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's get started." The woman, frozen in his grasp, could only stammer. It was my mother's." Julian's world tilted on its axis. "My mother's." The words echoed in the sudden, roaring silence of his mind. He looked at her again, truly looked at her. He saw the shape of her eyes, the curve of her jaw. It was not Isabella's face, but there were echoes. Faint whispers of a memory he thought he had lost forever. "Your mother," he repeated, his voice low and strained. "What was her name?" Fear warred with confusion in her eyes. "Why?" "Please, just let go of my hand." He held on, his grip unyielding. It was not a threat. It was an anchor. He was adrift in a sea of 40 years, and this girl, this ring, was the only solid thing he could hold on to. "Tell me her name," he commanded, his tone softer now, but no less insistent. "Isabella," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My mother's name was Isabella." The anchor gave way. He was falling. Julian Thorne was a name spoken in whispers in the darkest corners of the city. They called him the Old Lion. A man who had built an empire on a foundation of loyalty, fear, and an unbending personal code. His word was iron. His vengeance was legend. He was a relic from a different era, a time when honor, even among thieves, meant something. His rules were simple and absolute. "You do not lie to me. You do not steal from me. And you do not harm the innocent." This last rule was the one for which he was most feared. He had dismantled entire organizations, ruined powerful men, all because they had broken that one, simple rule. They had preyed on the helpless, the women, the children, the people outside the game. To Julian, that was the greatest sin. A lack of honor. A stain that could only be cleansed with absolute finality. No one knew why. His men, even Leo who had been with him for 20 years, did not know the origin of that code. They only knew to obey it. They saw it as a quirk, a strange sentimentality in an otherwise ruthless man. They did not know about Isabella. She had been the daughter of a baker. A girl with flour on her hands and laughter in her eyes. He had been a young man then, hungry and ambitious, just starting to make his name on the streets. He was dangerous, and she was everything good and pure in the world. They fell in love with the fierce, desperate intensity of youth. He had the ring made for her. It was a promise. The intertwined vines represented their lives, bound together. The hidden star was her. His North Star. His guiding light. He promised her he would leave the life, that they would go away somewhere quiet and build a life together. But her family had been terrified of him. Of what he was. They sent her away. To another city, another state, they wouldn't tell him where. They told him she had married someone else, a safe man, a good man. They begged him to leave her be, to not bring his world crashing down upon her. And so, for the only time in his life, Julian Thorne had backed down. He had loved her enough to let her go, to let her have the safe life he could never provide. The loss of her hollowed him out. It forged the man he would become. The hope died, and the old lion was born. He built his empire, but his heart remained empty, frozen in that moment of loss. He never loved again. He never even tried. Now, 40 years later, her daughter stood before him. A ghost wearing her ring. He finally released her hand. The sudden absence of contact left his own hand feeling cold and empty. The young woman, Ilara, rubbed her wrist, her eyes still wide with fear and confusion. "Come," Julian said, his voice regaining some of its usual command. He stood up. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. "Sit down." He gestured to the seat opposite him. She hesitated, glancing toward the door as if contemplating escape. But there was no escape. His men were shadows, blocking any path. And there was something in his eyes, a deep, ancient sadness, that held her in place more effectively than any guard. She slid into the booth, perching on the edge of the seat, ready to bolt. Julian sat back down. He motioned to Leo. "Bring her some tea. And something to eat." Leo nodded, his face a mask of professional calm, but his eyes betrayed his shock. He had never seen the boss like this. Never. Julian looked at the girl. "Ilara. Isabella's daughter. You are in trouble," he stated. It was not a question. Desperation was a scent he knew well. He had worn it himself as a young man. She flinched, then nodded, her gaze dropping to the worn tabletop. "Yes." "Tell me," he said. The story came out in a torrent of quiet, frightened words. Her mother, Isabella, had passed away 6 months ago from an illness. She had been a single mother for most of Ilara's life. They had never had much, but they had each other. Her father, he had been in and out of their lives. A man who chased luck and never caught it. A gambler. After Isabella's death, he had shown up again, full of grief and promises. He had quickly fallen back into old habits. He borrowed money. A lot of money. From the wrong kind of person. He disappeared last week, Ilara whispered, her voice cracking. Then the man he borrowed from, he came to see me. He said my father's debt was my debt now. He said I had until the end of the week to pay him back. "How much?" Julian asked, his voice dangerously quiet. $50,000, she said, the number sounding like a death sentence on her lips. "I don't have it. I have nothing. I've been selling everything we owned. My mother's things. It's not enough. This ring, it was the last thing I had left of hers. I couldn't sell it. Not this." She clutched her hand, protecting the ring. Protecting the memory. "This man," Julian said, his eyes turning to hard chips of ice. "Does he have a name?" "He told me to call him Mr. Thorne," she said. The air left the room. Thorne. Julian felt a cold, black rage begin to build in his chest. A rage he had not felt in years. It was a familiar feeling, the righteous anger that had fueled his entire life. "He has dark hair," Ilara continued, unaware of the storm she had just unleashed. "A scar above his right eyebrow. He drives a black sports car and wears suits that look too expensive for him." Marcus. His own nephew. His brother's boy. Julian had cast Marcus out of the family years ago. The boy was rotten from the inside out. All greed and no honor. He had been caught shaking down shopkeepers, using the Thorn name for his own petty extortion rackets. Julian had confronted him, given him a warning. "Stay out of my city. Stop using my name." Marcus had spat at his feet, full of arrogant defiance. He had no respect for the old ways. No respect for the code. And now he was preying on the daughter of Isabella. The universe had a cruel, poetic sense of humor. It had brought his greatest failure and his greatest shame together and laid them at his feet. A waiter arrived with a steaming pot of tea and a plate of warm pastries. Ilara stared at the food as if it were an illusion. She was clearly starving. "Eat," Julian said gently. She looked up at him, her fear momentarily replaced by a flicker of hope. "Can you help me? I heard people say that if you're in real trouble, you come to this restaurant. They say the owner can fix things." She had no idea she was speaking to the owner himself. "How are you going to pay me?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. She reached into her basket and pulled out one of the paper flowers. A white rose, its petals perfectly formed. She pushed it across the table. "It's all I have," she whispered. Julian looked at the paper flower. He looked at her face, a pale, fragile echo of the only woman he had ever loved. He looked at the ring on her finger, a symbol of a promise he had failed to keep. In that moment, a decision was made. A 40-year-old account was about to be settled. He picked up the paper flower. Its delicate weight was nothing in his hand, yet it felt heavier than all the gold in his vaults. He was looking at Isabella's daughter. The child he might have had. The life he might have lived. The world had taken Isabella from him. He would not let it take her daughter, too. His own blood, his nephew, was a cancer that had attached itself to the one pure memory he had left. It was a sacrilege. An unforgivable sin. He felt the ice around his heart begin to crack. Not to melt, but to splinter. A lifetime of carefully constructed emotional armor was failing. He saw the path ahead of him, clear and absolute. It was not a path of business or profit. It was a path of redemption. "This man," Julian said, his voice now devoid of all emotion, a flat, chilling calm. "He will not bother you again." Ilara stared at him, her eyes filling with tears. Not of sadness, but of overwhelming relief. "Really? But how?" "I can't pay you." Julian looked at the paper flower in his hand. "You already have," he said. He turned his head slightly, his gaze finding Leo, who had been watching the entire exchange with a hawk's intensity. Julian gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. The command was given. The machine was now in motion. Leo understood. He walked over to the table. He looked at Ilara with a strange expression, a mix of pity and awe. He had never seen his boss act this way. This was personal. This was something deeper than business. "Miss," Leo said, his voice respectful. "Please come with me. We have a safe place for you to wait." Ilara looked from Leo to Julian, her brow furrowed with uncertainty. "Wait? Wait for what?" "For me to keep my promise," Julian said. He met her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw not a gangster, not a dangerous man, but a protector. An old lion rousing from a long sleep to defend its own. She stood up, her movement slow and hesitant. She looked back at the table, at the half-eaten pastry, the untouched tea. A small island of impossible kindness in her sea of trouble. "Thank you," she whispered to Julian. The words were small, but they carried the weight of a life saved. Julian simply nodded. He watched as Leo escorted her out through a private exit, away from the prying eyes of the other diners. He was alone again in his corner booth. But the silence was different now. It was not empty. It was charged. It was waiting. He sat for a long moment, staring at the paper flower. He traced its delicate edges with his thumb, just as he had traced the vines on the silver ring all those years ago. A promise made. A promise broken. And now, a new promise to be kept. He finally took a sip of the amber liquid in his glass. It burned all the way down. A fire to counter the ice. Then he pulled out his phone. He scrolled to a single contact. A name he had not called in a very long time. His fingers hovered over the screen. This was not just about Marcus anymore. This was about cleansing the stain. He pressed the call button. The voice on the other end answered immediately, professional and alert. "Leo," Julian said, his voice like gravel. "Find my nephew." "We have a location, boss," Leo's voice came back, crisp and efficient. "A warehouse down by the docks. He runs his little operation out of there." "Is he there now?" "He is." "Bring him to me," Julian commanded. "To our own warehouse. The one on the west side. I want him alone. I want him quiet." "Understood," Leo said. There was a pause. "Boss, are you sure about this?" "His family." "He stopped being family when he put his hands on the desperate," Julian said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "He stopped being family when he used my name to dishonor her memory." Leo did not need to ask who her was. He could hear it in the boss's voice. A ghost had just walked into their lives. "We're on our way," Leo said, and the line went dead. Julian placed the phone on the table. He carefully folded the paper flower and tucked it into the breast pocket of his suit jacket, right over his heart. Then he stood up. The meal was over. The ritual was broken. It was time to go to work. The warehouse was a cathedral of concrete and steel, smelling of rust and cold river water. A single high-intensity bulb hung from the rafters, casting a stark circle of white light on the dusty floor. The rest of the cavernous space was lost in shadow. Julian Thorne stood just outside the circle of light, a silhouette against the darkness. His hands were clasped behind his back. He was patient. He had been waiting 40 years for this moment, in a way. Another few minutes would not matter. Leo and 2 other men entered through a side door, their footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. Between them, they propelled a man forward. Marcus Thorne. He was exactly as Elara had described. The expensive suit, now rumpled. The arrogant sneer, now tinged with fear. The scar above his eye was a pale, jagged line against his flushed skin. They shoved him into the center of the light, and he stumbled, catching himself before he fell. He looked around wildly, his eyes trying to adjust. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice trying for authority but cracking under the strain. "Do you have any idea who I am?" He saw the figures in the shadows but could not make them out. He assumed this was a rival crew, some petty dispute over territory. He was not yet truly afraid. He was just angry. Annoyed. "My uncle runs this city," he shouted into the darkness. "When he finds out about this, you're all dead." From the shadows, Julian's voice emerged, calm and cold as a tombstone. "He already knows." Marcus froze. He recognized that voice. He had not heard it in years, but he had never forgotten it. The blood drained from his face. The false bravado crumbled into dust, replaced by a raw, primal fear. Julian stepped into the light. He looked older than Marcus remembered. His hair was more silver than black. There were deeper lines etched around his eyes and mouth. But the eyes themselves, they were unchanged. They were the eyes of the old lion. And they were fixed on him with an expression of profound disappointment and cold fury. "Uncle Julian," Marcus stammered, his voice a pathetic squeak. I don't understand. What's going on?" Julian walked slowly toward him, his footsteps unnervingly quiet on the concrete floor. He stopped just a few feet away. He looked his nephew up and down, a flicker of disgust in his eyes. "I gave you a command, Marcus," Julian said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I told you to stay out of my city. I told you to stop using my name." "I didn't," Marcus said quickly, his hands held up in a placating gesture. "I swear. I've been careful." This is just small business. Nothing that would interfere with you. Small business, Julian repeated, the words dripping with contempt. You call preying on the weak small businesses? You call threatening a grieving girl small businesses? Marcus's eyes widened. He made the connection. The girl or the one with the flowers? That's what this is about? Uncle, she's a nobody. Her deadbeat father owed me $50,000. The debt was not hers, Julian said flatly. It is now. That's how it works. Marcus argued, a hint of his old arrogance returning. You know the rules. You know nothing of my rules, Julian shot back, his voice cracking like a whip. He took another step forward, invading Marcus's personal space. The younger man flinched and tried to step back, but Leo and another man moved in behind him, blocking his retreat. Julian reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded paper flower. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger. Do you know what this is? He asked. Marcus stared at it, confused. It's a paper flower. From the girl. It's worthless. Worthless, Julian echoed, a strange, sad smile touching his lips. He looked at the flower, then back at his nephew. This girl's mother, her name was Isabella. He let the name hang in the air. It meant nothing to Marcus. It was just a name. 40 years ago, Julian continued, his voice becoming distant, as if he were speaking more to himself than to Marcus, I gave a ring to a young woman named Isabella. A silver ring with vines and a single star. It was a promise. A promise of a different life. He paused, his eyes boring into Marcus's. The girl you threatened. Elara, she wears that ring. It was her mother's. Understanding, cold and terrifying, finally dawned on Marcus's face. This was not about territory. This was not about money. This was about a ghost from his uncle's past. A ghost he had unknowingly desecrated. Uncle, I didn't know, he pleaded, his voice breaking. I swear to you, if I had known she was connected to you. That is the point. Julian roared, his voice exploding in the cavernous space. The sound was shocking in its raw power. It shouldn't matter if she is connected to me. She is innocent. She is unprotected. And you, a man who carries my blood, my name, used her pain for profit. You have no honor. He fell silent, his chest heaving. The rage was a living thing inside him, a beast he had kept chained for decades. You stood in my city, Julian said, his voice dropping back to a lethal calm. You used my name. And you brought your filth to the doorstep of the only clean memory I have left. He looked at Marcus with a final, chilling emptiness. There was no anger left in his eyes. Only judgment. I built my world on a code, Julian said softly. A code you have spat upon. There are consequences for that. He turned his back on his nephew. A final, absolute dismissal. He walked toward the shadows at the edge of the light, leaving Marcus standing alone, trembling under the harsh glare of the single bulb. Leo, Julian said without looking back. Boss? Leo's voice was steady. The debt owed by Elara's father is cancelled. Permanently, Julian stated. And see to it that my nephew will not be bothering anyone. Ever again. He did not wait for a reply. He walked out of the warehouse and into the cold night air, not looking back. He did not need to. The problem was erased. The account was settled. The sound of the heavy warehouse door sliding shut behind him was the only punctuation needed. It was the sound of a chapter, 40 years in the making, finally coming to a close. The apartment was high above the city, a sanctuary of clean lines and quiet luxury. It was one of Julian's private residencies, a place few people even knew existed. Elara sat on a plush sofa, a cashmere blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She had showered and eaten, but she still looked like a fragile bird, poised for flight. She heard the door open, and she tensed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Julian entered the room. He had taken off his suit jacket and rolled up the sleeves of his white shirt. He looked less like a crime lord and more like a weary patriarch returning home. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes gentle. "It's done," he said softly. Ilara stood up, letting the blanket fall to the floor. "Done? What's done?" "The debt is gone," he explained. "The man who was threatening you, he will not be a problem anymore. You are safe." The relief that washed over her was so powerful it made her dizzy. Her legs felt weak, and she sank back onto the sofa. Tears streamed down her face, silent and cleansing. "How?" she whispered through her tears. "How did you do it?" Julian did not answer immediately. He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the glittering expanse of the city below. His city. "I called in a debt of my own," he said, his back still to her. She wiped her eyes, her gaze fixed on his broad back. "I don't know how to thank you. I have nothing to give you." She looked down at her hand, at the silver ring. With trembling fingers, she slid it off. It felt warm from her skin. She stood up and walked toward him, holding it out. "Please," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Take this. It's the most valuable thing I own. It's the only way I can repay you." Julian turned around slowly. He looked at the ring in her outstretched palm. The little silver promise. He saw a ghost of another hand offering it back to him, a hand he had not touched in a lifetime. He gently closed her fingers over the ring. "No," he said, his voice husky. "That is not a payment. That is a memory. And it belongs to you." He pushed her hand back toward her own chest. "Keep it. Wear it. Remember your mother." "But I owe you everything," she insisted, her eyes searching his face, trying to understand the depths she saw there. "You owe me nothing," he said. He met her gaze, and for the first time, he let her see past the walls, past the ice. He let her see the grieving young man who still lived inside the old lion. "Your mother, she was a promise I made to myself. A promise to be a better man. I failed to keep it. Protecting you, this is my chance to finally honor it. What you gave me tonight was not a paper flower. It was a second chance. That is worth more than any amount of money." The raw, unguarded emotion in his voice stunned her into silence. She finally began to understand. This was not about her debt. This was about his. She slid the ring back onto her finger. It felt like it belonged there again. A long silence settled between them, comfortable and profound. The chaos was over. The storm had passed. Finally, she asked the question that had been circling in her mind for hours. The question that separated his world from hers. "Who are you?" she asked softly. "All those things they say about you are the whispers, are they true? Are you a bad man?" Julian looked away from her, back toward the city lights. He considered the question. He had asked it of himself 1,000 times over the years. He was a man who had committed terrible acts in the name of his own brand of justice. He had hurt people. He had broken laws. He was no saint. But then he looked back at her. At Isabella's daughter. Safe. Whole. Free. "I am what I have to be," he answered, his voice a low murmur. "For most of my life, that has meant being a man you would call bad, but tonight," he said, a faint, sad smile touching his lips, "tonight, because of you, and because of her. I got to be the man I always should have been." He reached into his wallet and pulled out a simple, stark white business card. It had no name, no address. Just a single phone number printed in black ink. He pressed it into her hand. "This is my private number," he said. "If you ever need anything, no matter how small, you call this number. You are under my protection now. That is a promise that will not be broken." He had one last thing to do. He had his lawyers establish a blind trust in her name, funded with enough money to ensure she would never have to worry again. She could go to school, start a business, build a life. A safe life. The life her mother would have wanted for her. The life he had once dreamed of giving Isabella. It was a quiet act of penance. A final settling of his own soul's debt. 3 years passed. The city moved on. Stories faded into legends. The name Marcus Thorne was never spoken again. On a sunny corner in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, a small shop bloomed. Ilara's Garden, the sign read in elegant, flowing script. Inside, the air smelled of fresh earth, lavender, and roses. Ilara was behind the counter, her hands dusty with potting soil. She was no longer the thin, frightened girl from the restaurant. Her face was fuller, her eyes bright with purpose and peace. She had finished a degree in horticulture. Her shop was her passion, a thriving testament to her new life. The bell above the door chimed, and she looked up, a warm smile spreading across her face. Julian Thorne stood in the doorway. He visited once a month. He never stayed long. He would walk in, his large frame seeming to fill the small, bright space. He would buy a single white rose, a real one this time, and they would exchange a few quiet words. They never spoke of that night. They never spoke of her mother, or his nephew, or the warehouse by the docks. They did not have to. It was an understanding that ran deeper than words. A bond forged in a moment of desperation and redemption. He was not her father. He was not her friend. He was something else entirely. Her guardian. Her silent protector. The old lion watching over his own. "Julian," she said, her smile genuine. "It's good to see you." "Ilara," he replied, his voice the same low rumble, but the edges were softer now. "The shop is looking good." "Business is booming," she said, her hands deftly wrapping the stem of a perfect white rose. He paid for the flower, his large, scarred hand brushing against hers. On her finger, the silver ring with the intertwined vines and the hidden star caught the sunlight. He took the rose, gave a small nod, and left as quietly as he had arrived. Ilara watched him go, a wave of gratitude washing over her, as it always did. He had given her back her life. And in some small, unspoken way, she knew she had given him something back, too. A piece of his own soul he thought was lost forever. Later that day, in a sterile, minimalist office high atop a skyscraper, Julian Thorne sat at his massive mahogany desk. The desk was clear of all clutter, save for a phone, a pen, and a single, small object encased in a glass cube. It was a paper flower. A small, white rose, perfectly preserved. He would look at it sometimes, in the quiet moments between deals and decisions. It was a reminder. A memento of the night a ghost from his past gave him a chance to be a good man, if only for a little while. True strength is not always found in the power to command or the will to conquer. Sometimes, the greatest strength is found in a moment of unexpected compassion. It is the courage to protect the vulnerable, to honor a memory, and to answer the call of a long-lost promise. For even in the most hardened of hearts, there is often a quiet corner where love waits patiently for a chance at redemption, proving that the most profound acts of kindness can bloom in the most unlikely of gardens.